The soundstage lights have gone dark on so many things that Lowe's Angels once was before the movies arrived. Orange groves stretching toward the foothills, dusty roads connecting sleepy farming towns, a climate so mild and so reliably sunny that men with cameras and ambition began to notice it long before anyone imagined an industry would rise there. In the earliest years of the 20th century, filmmakers on the East Coast were paying royalties to patent holders who controlled the basic technology of motion pictures, and many of them simply packed up their equipment and fled west, 3,000 miles from the courts and the lawyers, to a stretch of Southern California where the sun shone nearly year-round, and the light was perfect for the cameras of the era. What they found was cheap land, varied scenery within a short drive, mountains, desert, ocean, farmland, and a local economy hungry enough for investment that nobody much minded what these strange traveling picture shows were up to. Within a couple of decades, a loose collection of orange groves and bean fields had become the center of a global industry, and the name of one small township, Hollywood, would come to stand for something far larger than the town itself ever was. By the 1920s, the industry had begun to organize itself into the shape it would keep for the next several decades. A handful of companies, built by men who had often started as immigrants working in far humbler trades, furriers, glove salesmen, Nickelodeon operators, had consolidated enough capital and enough theaters to control nearly every stage of the business. From the writing of a script to the moment a ticket was torn at a box office thousands of miles away. This vertical integration, as economists would later call it, meant that a small number of companies did not simply make films. They owned the cameras, employed the writers and directors and technicians, held performers under exclusive contract, and owned or controlled the theater chains where the finished pictures would be shown. It was an extraordinarily efficient machine for producing entertainment at scale, and it was also, by design, a machine that placed enormous power in very few hands. The men who ran these companies were sometimes called moguls, a term borrowed half-mockingly from the Mughal emperors of India, and the description was not entirely unfair. Within the walls of their own studios, their word was closer to law than to ordinary business management. Understanding what daily life felt like inside this system requires understanding first who these companies actually were and how they differed from one another, because the so-called Golden Age was never really one single machine but several competing ones, all operating by similar rules. A handful of major studios controlled the bulk of American filmmaking through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Some specialized in glossy, sophisticated productions with lavish sets and internationally recognized stars. Others built reputations on more modestly budgeted, efficiently produced pictures turned out at a punishing pace. A few carved out particular niches, whether in horror, in westerns, or in the kind of wholesome family entertainment that filled theaters in small towns across the country. Beneath these major companies sat a tier of smaller studios, often called by the somewhat unflattering nickname of Poverty Row, which produced pictures on shoestring budgets, sometimes shooting an entire feature in less than a week. For a performer or a technician, which rung of this ladder you occupied shaped nearly everything about your working life, from your salary to your working hours to how much creative control, if any, you were ever permitted to exercise. What united nearly all of these companies, large and small, was the contract system, and to understand the golden age at the level of the individual human being, it helps to understand what that system actually demanded of the people caught inside it. A studio contract in this era bore only a passing resemblance to what a modern audience might think of as an employment agreement. It was typically structured around a period of years, commonly 7, though the number varied by studio and by the leverage, however limited, that a given performer might have possessed at the moment of signing. Within that term, the studio held what was known as an option, a right renewed at fixed intervals, often every 6 months, to decide whether it wished to continue employing the performer at all. If the studio chose not to exercise the option, The performer was simply released, free to seek work elsewhere but with no guarantee that anyone else would want them. If the studio did exercise the option, the performer remained bound, frequently at a salary structure that had been fixed at the outset of the contract, and that increased only modestly, if at all, regardless of how much the performer's box office value might have grown in the meantime. The asymmetry built into these agreements was substantial, and, from a modern legal standpoint, would raise serious concerns about fairness and bargaining power. The performer could not simply walk away to accept a better offer from a competing studio. Doing so would have violated the contract and exposed them to legal liability. And in any case, the major studios had, for long stretches of this period, informal understandings among themselves not to poach one another's contracted talent, which meant a performer dissatisfied with their treatment at one studio had little real leverage to seek better terms at another. Meanwhile, if a performer refused a role they found distasteful, unsuitable, or simply beneath their ambitions, the studio could place them on suspension, withholding pay for the duration of the dispute. In many contracts, time spent on suspension was added to the end of the contract term rather than simply passing, meaning a performer who repeatedly refused unwanted work could find their obligation to the studio stretching years beyond the period they had originally agreed to. This threat alone did a great deal to discourage performers from exercising whatever creative judgment they might otherwise have brought to their own careers. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine this system as something imposed entirely against the will of everyone who entered it, or to flatten the real complexity of how performers experienced their contracts. For some, particularly those who arrived in Hollywood with little money and few other prospects, the security of a guaranteed studio salary, however modest by comparison to the value they generated, represented a genuine improvement over the uncertainty of a life spent searching for stage work or scraping by in ordinary jobs. The studio system also provided, at least for those the studios judged worth investing in, an extraordinary apparatus of professional training, publicity, and career management that an individual performer working independently could rarely have assembled on their own. The bargain was not simply exploitation with no compensating benefit. It was a trade of independence and a fair share of one's own earning power in exchange for security, training, and the machinery of stardom. Whether that trade was a fair one depended enormously on the individual circumstances of the person making it, on how replaceable the studio considered them, and on how willing they were to accept the loss of control over so much of their own life. To see how this system actually operated at ground level, it helps to follow the path that a great many hopeful performers took in these years, understanding that the specific details varied enormously from person to person, but that certain patterns recurred often enough to be considered broadly representative of the era. Southern California in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s attracted a remarkable volume of young people, disproportionately though by no means exclusively young women, who arrived by train or by bus from every part of the country, drawn by the same basic promise, that a combination of good looks, talent, and sheer luck might transform an ordinary life into an extraordinary one. Some arrived with formal training in acting, dance, or music, often gained through community theater, vaudeville circuits, or the kind of local pageant and talent competitions that flourished across small-town America in this period. Others arrived with nothing more than the encouragement of family or friends who had told them, sincerely or not, that they possessed the kind of looks the movies were said to be looking for. The reality that greeted most of these arrivals bore little resemblance to the fantasy that had brought them west. Hollywood and its surrounding neighborhoods filled with boarding houses, catering specifically to young people trying to break into pictures, modest establishments where several boarders might share a bathroom, and where a single telephone in a common hallway served as the fragile lifeline to any opportunity that might present itself. The organized, legitimate path into the industry ran primarily through a system known as central casting, a clearinghouse established in the mid-1920s to coordinate the hearing of extras across the major studios. Registering with central casting did not guarantee work. It simply placed a hopeful's name and photograph into a pool from which studios might, on a given day, select background performers for a crowd scene, a ballroom sequence, or any of the countless moments in a film that required warm bodies filling out the edges of a shot. Pay for extra work was modest, and the work itself was unpredictable, arriving in bursts followed by long stretches of nothing at all. Alongside this legitimate infrastructure flourished a considerably less reputable one, and it is worth speaking plainly about it, because it shaped the experience of Hollywood hopefuls in ways that both contemporary accounts and later historical scholarship have documented extensively. Los Angeles in this era supported a substantial population of self-styled talent agents, photographers, and acting coaches, some legitimate and many not, who made a living charging fees to newcomers desperate for any professional foothold. A young arrival might be persuaded to pay for a portfolio of photographs, for private acting lessons, or for the services of an agent who promised connections at the studios that, in reality, they did not possess. The genuine studios, for their part, did not charge prospective talent for auditions or screen tests, and the accumulated folk wisdom of the industry, passed from one disappointed hopeful to the next, eventually crystallized into a fairly consistent warning that anyone asking a newcomer for money in exchange for the promise of stardom was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, running some version of a confidence scheme. For the small fraction of hopefuls who did manage to attract genuine studio interest, the machinery of stardom, such as it was, began to engage. This might start with a screen test, a short-filmed audition intended to reveal how a given face and voice actually translated onto film, since the camera's judgment on this question was famously unpredictable and did not always align with how a person appeared in ordinary life. Performers who tested well and who caught the attention of a studio executive with the authority to sign new talent might then be offered a standard contract, typically at a modest starting salary, since studios reasoned, not unfairly from a business standpoint, that an unproven newcomer represented a significant financial risk. What followed this initial signing was, for many performers, one of the most disorienting transformations of their entire professional lives, because the studio's investment in a new contract player rarely stopped at simply putting them in front of a camera. It extended into a systematic reconstruction of who that person appeared to be. Renaming was often the first and most symbolically loaded step in that transformation. Studio publicity departments and casting executives operated on a fairly consistent theory of what made a name effective for marquee purposes. It needed to be short enough to read easily at a glance, phonetically simple enough that audiences across a country with enormously varied regional accents and immigrant backgrounds could pronounce and remember it without effort, and free of associations that studio executives worried might limit a performer's appeal to particular audiences. Names that sounded distinctly foreign, distinctly regional, or simply too ordinary were frequently altered, sometimes with the performer's active participation in choosing an alternative, and sometimes with considerably less input than that. It is worth noting, in fairness to the historical record, that name changes in this era were not exclusively or even primarily an act of studio coercion in every case. Many performers arrived in Hollywood already having used a stage name in earlier vaudeville or theater work, and some embraced the opportunity to reinvent themselves as a genuine creative choice rather than an imposition. Still, the pattern of studios altering names, ages, birthplaces, and biographical details to fit a more marketable profile was widespread and well documented, and it reflected a broader truth about how the industry approached its performers, as a kind of raw material to be shaped into a more sellable form, with the performer's own preferences a secondary consideration at best. The physical remaking of a contract player followed a similar logic, and in many documented cases, went considerably further than a change of name. Dental work was common, since crooked or discolored teeth photographed poorly under the harsh, high-wattage lighting required by the film stocks and lenses of the period. Hairlines were sometimes altered through electrolysis, a process that used electrical current to permanently remove hair follicle by follicle. In cases where a studio's cosmetic advisors judged a performer's natural hairline unsuitable for the kind of face they wished to present on screen. Eyebrows were frequently reshaped through plucking into thin, arched lines that dominated fashion photography of the period. A look considered glamorous at the time, though it required extensive and often uncomfortable maintenance to sustain. Weight was monitored closely, particularly though not exclusively for women, with studio contracts sometimes including explicit language, permitting the studio to require a performer to maintain a specified weight range, and studio-employed nutritionists or physicians issuing directives about diet that by later medical standards would be considered dangerously restrictive. This last point deserves particular care, because it touches on genuine health consequences that a number of performers experienced during this period, and the historical record here is serious enough to warrant sober treatment rather than either sensationalism or dismissal. Studio-affiliated physicians in this era did, according to numerous biographical and journalistic accounts published across subsequent decades, sometimes prescribe amphetamine-based stimulants to help performers manage the extraordinarily demanding production schedules common at the major studios, schedules that could run to 12, 14, or 16 hours across 6-day work weeks for months at a stretch. These stimulants, marketed and understood at the time as a legitimate medical tool rather than the seriously regulated controlled substance they would later become, were intended to combat fatigue and, not incidentally, to suppress appetite in performers under pressure to remain thin. Because these stimulants made ordinary sleep difficult, some performers were in turn prescribed barbiturate sedatives to help them rest during the brief windows of time available between the end of one shooting day and the beginning of the next. The combination of stimulants to get through the day and sedatives to get through the night created, for a documented number of performers, patterns of dependency that caused serious and sometimes lasting harm, a fact that later generations of historians and biographers have treated as one of the genuine tragedies embedded within the glamorous surface of the studio era. It is important, in discussing this history, neither to exaggerate its universality, since the experience varied enormously by studio, by individual physician, and by the specific performer involved, nor to minimize the real damage it caused to the people who lived through it. The training regimen imposed on new contract players extended well beyond matters of appearance and health into the realm of skills the studios considered essential to a marketable screen presence. Voice and diction coaches worked to soften or eliminate regional accents that studio executives judged too narrowly identified with a particular part of the country, or in some cases, to help performers with foreign accents adopt a more neutral, broadly intelligible American pronunciation, since silent film had of course placed no demands whatsoever on a performer's speaking voice. And the arrival of synchronized sound in the late 1920s abruptly made vocal quality a central concern for the first time. Dance instruction was common even for performers with no evident ambition toward musical roles, since studios valued physical grace and control in any performer likely to appear in the kind of romantic or dramatic scenes that required convincing, controlled movement. Fencing instruction served the more specific purpose of preparing performers, particularly men being groomed for adventure or costume pictures, for the swashbuckling roles that remained popular box office draws throughout the period. Horseback riding was essential training for performers likely to appear in the Western pictures that constituted a substantial and reliable portion of American film output throughout these decades, since a performer who rode awkwardly could ruin the visual credibility of an entire sequence. Even something as seemingly basic as walking became, for many new contract players, a subject of formal instruction, and this detail, however small it might sound, illustrates something important about how thoroughly the studio system approached the manufacture of its stars. Studio-employed drama and deportment coaches worked with performers on posture, on the carriage of the shoulders and head, on a controlled and graceful manner of entering a room or crossing a set, all in service of a broader goal that had less to do with any single skill than with producing a performer capable of embodying, convincingly and consistently, the particular type of screen persona the studio had decided suited them best. This points to another defining feature of the studio system: the tendency to sort contract players into fairly narrow, recognizable types, whether the wholesome young leading lady, the rugged adventure hero, the sophisticated romantic lead, or any of a handful of other recurring categories that studio marketing departments had found, through years of box office experience, tended to sell tickets reliably. Once a studio had settled on the type it believed suited a given performer, that categorization often proved remarkably difficult to escape, shaping the roles offered to that performer for years or even the whole remainder of their contracted career, regardless of whether the performer harbored ambitions toward a broader or more varied range of work. The publicity apparatus that surrounded every major studio represented perhaps the most elaborate and, in retrospect, the most fictionalized layer of the entire system. Each major studio maintained a substantial publicity department whose function extended well beyond simply promoting individual films to the ongoing, continuous construction and maintenance of each contract player's public identity. This frequently involved rewriting biographical details in ways ranging from mild embellishment to outright fabrication, adjusting a performer's stated age downward, relocating a stated birthplace to somewhere the department judged more appealing or exotic, inventing wholesome anecdotes about small-town upbringings or hardworking families that bore little resemblance to a performer's actual background, and omitting entirely any biographical detail, whether a previous marriage, a difficult family situation, or an inconvenient personal history, that the department judged likely to damage the carefully constructed public image. Fan magazines, an enormously popular publishing category throughout this period with circulation numbers in the millions, functioned in close and often financially entangled cooperation with studio publicity departments, running features, staged photo spreads, and manufactured personal anecdotes that studios supplied, and that magazine editors had considerable financial incentive to print largely unaltered, since access to future stories depended on maintaining a cooperative relationship with the studios that controlled it. Public romances, too, were frequently arranged rather than organic, a practice publicists referred to at the time by a term that has persisted into modern usage: the arranged pairing of two contracted performers for a staged public appearance, a premiere date, or an ongoing publicized romance, undertaken purely for promotional purposes and coordinated with photographers and gossip columnists in advance. This practice served several purposes for the studios that employed it. It generated publicity and press coverage for both performers involved, particularly valuable when one or both had a film approaching release. It could also serve, in a number of documented and extensively researched cases, as a form of protective cover for performers whose actual private lives, including their romantic relationships, would have violated the extremely narrow standards of acceptable public behavior that studios enforced during this period. Standards that left performers whose orientation or relationships fell outside prevailing social norms of the time with essentially no way to live openly without risking the abrupt end of their careers. The human cost of this arrangement, for the individuals living inside it, is a subject, later historians and biographers have approached with considerably more empathy and nuance than the gossip press of the era ever afforded them. Governing all of this, threaded through every contract and every publicity strategy, was a provision that came to be known as the morality clause, a piece of contractual language that had entered standard studio agreements in the aftermath of several genuinely serious and widely publicized scandals in the early 1920s that badly damaged the industry's public reputation and prompted real fear among studio executives that state or federal regulators, or an organized public boycott, might impose far stricter external controls on the industry than anything the studios were prepared to accept. The morality clause typically granted the studio broad, often vaguely defined authority to terminate a performer's contract if that performer's public conduct was judged to bring the studio or the broader industry into disrepute. In practice, this gave studios an extraordinarily wide latitude to police not just a performer's professional behavior but substantial portions of their private life as well, since almost any personal conduct the studio's own executives found embarrassing or commercially risky could plausibly be characterized as a violation. This same anxiety about public reputation, operating at the level of the industry as a whole rather than any single studio, would soon produce an even more sweeping form of self-regulation, one that would not simply govern the private conduct of performers, but would reach directly into the content of the films themselves. The anxiety that produced the morality clause in individual contracts found its industry-wide expression in a formal system of content regulation that would shape nearly every American film made between the early 1930s and the late 1960s. Following a series of scandals in the early 1920s, the major studios had already brought in a former postmaster general to serve as a kind of industry watchdog, hoping that visible self-policing would forestall government censorship. For much of that decade, this office issued guidelines with only limited enforcement power, and studios frequently ignored recommendations they found commercially inconvenient. By the early 1930s, however, a combination of factors, including the arrival of sound, which made suggestive dialogue possible in ways silent films' title cards had never quite allowed, along with continued pressure from religious organizations, women's civic groups, and state and municipal censorship boards that had begun cutting or banning films they found objectionable, pushed the industry toward a far more rigorously enforced code. This code, formally adopted in 1930 but not seriously enforced until 1934, established detailed and remarkably specific rules governing what could and could not appear on American movie screens. Certain subjects were essentially forbidden outright, including explicit depictions of criminal methods that might be imitated, and any suggestion that crime could go permanently unpunished by the film's conclusion. Depictions of marriage carried their own detailed requirements. Married couples, even when the story made clear they shared a bed in real life, were conventionally shown sleeping in separate twin beds, a visual convention so consistently applied across major studio productions of the period that it became one of the code's most recognizable, and to later audiences, most amusing legacies. Kisses were subject to duration limits enforced by the studio's own internal code compliance officers before a film could even be submitted for review. Certain words were banned outright from dialogue. Interracial relationships were essentially prohibited from sympathetic depiction. And the code's enforcement office, staffed by industry insiders who reviewed scripts before production and finished films before release, held the practical power to withhold the seal of approval that most American theater chains, bound by their own agreements, would not exhibit a film without. The effect of this system on the actual craft of filmmaking during these decades was considerable, and it produced, somewhat counterintuitively, a body of work often remembered for its sophistication and wit rather than for any sense of crude restriction. Writers and directors working under the code's constraints developed elaborate strategies of suggestion and implication, using visual metaphor, double entendre, and carefully constructed dialogue to communicate ideas the code technically forbade from direct depiction. A scene might cut away from a couple beginning to kiss to show a fireplace, or ocean waves, or a train entering a tunnel, images that audiences of the period understood perfectly well as a substitute for content the screen could not show directly. This game of implication, played between filmmakers and audiences, and largely over the heads of the code's own enforcement officers, became one of the defining stylistic features of American cinema throughout this period, and film historians have long debated whether the code's restrictions, whatever their more troubling implications for artistic freedom, inadvertently pushed filmmakers toward a kind of narrative sophistication that later, less restricted eras sometimes lost. Beyond the code's influence on the content of films, the daily physical experience of actually making them deserves careful attention, because the working conditions inside a major studio during this period were demanding in ways that a modern film or television production, governed by extensive union protections and workplace safety regulations that did not yet exist in anything like their current form, would find difficult to sustain. The technical requirements of film stock in this era, less sensitive to light than later stocks would become, meant that soundstages required an enormous volume of artificial lighting to properly expose a shot. The specific lighting instruments in wide use throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and well into the 1940s generated substantial heat, and performers working under this lighting for extended periods, particularly for scenes requiring heavy costuming, routinely endured working conditions that would today be considered a legitimate occupational safety concern. Reports from the period describe performers fainting on set from heat exposure, makeup melting and requiring constant retouching between takes, and a general physical toll that accumulated across the kind of extended shooting schedules common to major studio productions. The length of the working day itself compounded these physical demands. A 12-hour day was considered unremarkable by the standards of the period, and considerably longer days were far from unusual, particularly during the final push to complete a production on schedule, since every additional day of shooting represented a direct and substantial cost to the studio. Formal limits on consecutive working hours, guaranteed rest periods between shooting days, and other protections that later became standard through union contracts negotiated by organizations such as the Screen Actors Guild, founded in 1933 specifically in response to these kinds of working conditions, developed only gradually over the course of the 1930s and 1940s, and even after their establishment, enforcement in the earliest years remained inconsistent. A typical shooting day for a contract player might begin well before dawn with hours devoted to hair and makeup application, particularly demanding for performers required to achieve elaborate period looks, or for productions using the still-developing technology of color film, continue through a full day of filming punctuated by the extensive waiting periods inherent to film production, in which technical adjustments to lighting, camera position, or set dressing routinely consumed far more time than the actual filming of any given shot, and conclude well after dark, particularly during the 6-day working weeks that remained standard practice at most studios for much of this era. The physical demands extended into the wardrobe and costuming choices required by the fashions and production values of the period. Foundation garments, including corsets and other structured undergarments, designed to achieve the narrow-waisted silhouette that dominated women's fashion through much of the 1930s and 1940s, restricted breathing and movement in ways that performers had to learn to work around while still delivering convincing, naturalistic performances. Elaborately constructed gowns, particularly for prestige productions with substantial costume budgets, could be extremely heavy, laden with beading, layered fabric, and structural elements that made simply standing and moving gracefully across a set for hours at a time into its own significant physical exertion, all while wearing an expression of apparent effortlessness for the camera. High-heeled footwear, required for the fashionable silhouette of the period, and particularly demanding in the elaborate dance sequences that characterized the popular musical genre throughout the 1930s and into the 1950s, took a cumulative toll on performers required to dance in them across the many takes a complex number typically required. Male performers, while generally spared the more extreme elements of period female fashion, were not entirely exempt from physical discomfort in service of appearance, with some fitted into their own structured undergarments to achieve a more streamlined silhouette, and with height-enhancing footwear or platform devices sometimes employed for performers cast opposite significantly taller co-stars. The arrival of color cinematography, and particularly the demanding three-strip Technicolor process that became the industry's dominant color format from the mid-1930s through the early 1950s, introduced its own set of physical demands centered on makeup. Technicolor's particular sensitivity to certain tones meant that ordinary skin, photographed without adjustment, often appeared washed out, uneven, or unnatural on screen, requiring makeup artists to develop heavier, more saturated foundation formulas specifically calibrated to photograph correctly under the process's particular color sensitivity. Even though these same formulas often looked exaggerated or even alarming when viewed up close under ordinary lighting, rather than through a camera lens. This makeup had to be applied in thick layers and carefully maintained throughout long shooting days under hot studio lighting, creating real concerns about skin health for performers who wore it for extended periods across the length of an entire production. And it should be noted honestly that the cosmetics industry of this period operated under regulatory oversight considerably lighter than what exists today, meaning that ingredient safety standards for the formulas in wide use were not always what later decades would come to expect or require. Physical risk extended well beyond the ordinary discomforts of costume and lighting into genuine occupational hazard for performers involved in action sequences. And the historical record here documents a working environment with considerably less formal safety infrastructure than exists in modern film production. Professional stunt performers did exist throughout this period and handled a substantial portion of the genuinely dangerous physical action required by adventure films, westerns, and other action-oriented genres. But it was also common, particularly earlier in the era, and particularly among performers whose screen personas were built around physical daring, for the credited stars themselves to perform stunts that a modern production, guided by contemporary safety protocols and insurance requirements, would almost certainly assign exclusively to trained stunt professionals working with modern safety equipment. Horseback riding sequences, physical fight choreography, work around fire, water, and height, all carried real risk, and the specialized safety rigging, padding, and protective equipment that later became standard on productions involving this kind of physical action developed only gradually across these decades. Injuries did occur, sometimes serious ones, and the industry's characteristic instinct in handling them tended toward discretion and damage control rather than the kind of public safety review a serious onset injury would trigger in a modern production environment. For performers who did achieve genuine stardom and box office value within this system, one further mechanism deserves particular attention because it illustrates, perhaps more starkly than any other single practice, the extent to which contracted performers functioned within the industry's own internal logic as company assets rather than independent professionals. This was the practice of the loan-out, in which a performer's home studio, holding exclusive contractual rights to that performer's services, could negotiate directly with a competing studio to lend that performer out for a specific production, typically in exchange for a fee that could substantially exceed the performer's own contracted salary. The performer involved had, in the great majority of documented cases, no formal right to refuse such an arrangement, no say in which studio they were sent to or which project they would work on, and crucially, no claim whatsoever to the difference between what the borrowing studio paid for their services and what their home studio continued to pay them under the terms of their existing contract. A performer earning a modest weekly salary under a long-term contract might generate, through a single loan-out arrangement, many multiples of that salary for their home studio, all while their own compensation remained entirely unchanged. Studios also occasionally used the loan-out system punitively, assigning a performer who had proven difficult, who had refused a role, or who had otherwise displeased studio management, to an unappealing production at another studio as a form of professional discipline, a practice that starkly illustrated how little formal autonomy even a genuinely popular, bankable star actually possessed within the contract system. This raises a broader point about compensation that deserves careful and honest treatment, because popular imagination about the wealth of Golden Age film stars often diverges considerably from the documented financial reality experienced by many contract players, particularly those below the very highest tier of box office stardom. Contract salaries were negotiated, as noted earlier, at the outset of a performer's relationship with a studio, frequently when that performer possessed little to no bargaining leverage, and salary increases, where they occurred at all, tended to lag well behind any growth in that performer's actual box office value or public popularity. From these salaries, performers were frequently expected, whether through explicit contractual deduction or simply through the practical demands of maintaining the public image the studio required of them, to cover substantial personal expenses. Private wardrobe for public appearances not covered by production costs, publicity-related expenses, and in some cases the very acting, dance, and diction coaching the studio had originally arranged, which could be charged back against the performer rather than absorbed entirely by the studio itself. Suspension periods, discussed earlier as a disciplinary tool for performers who declined unwanted roles, meant a complete cessation of income for their duration, while a performer's personal expenses and the demands of maintaining a publicly glamorous lifestyle continued regardless. The cumulative effect of these financial pressures meant that a genuinely well-known, publicly recognized star could, and in a number of well-documented cases did, experience real financial precarity, an irony not lost on later biographers examining the gap between a performer's public image of glamour and wealth and their considerably more modest private financial reality. Even for performers who successfully navigated all of these pressures, built a substantial and profitable career within the studio system, and maintained the kind of public image the system demanded, one further and largely inescapable challenge awaited nearly everyone who worked within it. The passage of time itself, and the industry's famously unforgiving relationship with the aging process, a relationship that historical evidence suggests was applied with considerable asymmetry between male and female performers. Leading men in this era frequently found that aging presented relatively modest obstacles to continued casting in romantic or heroic roles, with a number of well-documented examples of male stars continuing to play romantic leads opposite considerably younger female co-stars, well into their 50s and beyond, their advancing age reframed by studio publicity as distinguished maturity rather than diminished appeal. Leading women, by contrast, encountered a narrower and more rapidly closing window of roles considered commercially viable by studio executives, with the transition away from romantic lead roles towards supporting, maternal, or character parts occurring, according to the accounts of numerous performers and the broader patterns documented by film historians, considerably earlier in a woman's career then the equivalent transition tended to occur for men. Often regardless of an individual performer's continued box office appeal, critical reputation, or evident skill. This asymmetry, rooted in the particular commercial assumptions studio executives held about what audiences wanted to see, shaped the working lives and career trajectories of a great many performers across the era, in ways that later generations of critics and historians have examined with considerably more scrutiny than the industry itself applied at the time. The end of a performer's relationship with their studio, when it came, arrived for most people not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, almost bureaucratic mechanism embedded in the contract structure from the very beginning. The studio's periodic option simply going unexercised. A studio under no obligation to explain or justify its decision could allow a contract to lapse at any renewal point, and for a performer whose entire professional identity, public image, and daily structure had been built around and by that studio relationship for years, the abrupt absence of that structure could prove genuinely disorienting. A fact reflected in numerous later interviews and memoirs by performers describing the psychological difficulty of adjusting to life and identity outside the total institutional structure the studio system had provided. What followed varied enormously by individual. Some performers transitioned successfully into character work, into television as that medium expanded rapidly through the 1950s, into other creative fields, or simply into private life, sometimes with considerable relief at finally escaping the intense control the studio system had exercised over their personal choices. Others found the transition considerably harder, struggling with the health consequences of years under studio-prescribed medication regimens, with the financial precarity that had often accompanied even a publicly glamorous career, or simply with the difficulty of establishing an adult identity and sense of self after so many years spent, in a very real sense, being managed and defined by other people. The physical world of the studio lot itself deserves its own careful description, because it represented something genuinely unusual in American economic life during this period. A nearly self-contained company town, walled and gated, that a contract player might pass through daily for years without ever fully leaving. A major studio lot in this era typically occupied dozens of acres, and within those walls existed an extraordinary density of specialized infrastructure. There were sound stages, cavernous windowless buildings insulated against outside noise, large enough to house entire built environments, from a full-scale New York street to a ship's deck to a European palace interior, all constructed from lumber, plaster, and paint by craftsmen who specialized in exactly this kind of illusion. There were standing outdoor sets as well, sometimes maintained for years and reused across dozens of productions with only cosmetic alteration. A western town facade doing service in one picture as a frontier settlement, and in another, with a change of signage and dressing, as an entirely different fictional location. Wardrobe departments housed thousands of costumes, some built new for a specific production, and others recycled and altered from earlier films, organized by era, by size, and by the particular requirements of whatever pictures were currently in production. Machine shops, carpentry shops, and paint departments employed skilled tradespeople whose work rarely received public credit, but who were essential to the illusion the studio sold. There were commissaries, essentially cafeterias, where the eclectic and sometimes surreal population of a working lot ate lunch together. A performer costumed as a Roman soldier might sit near a performer in a formal gown for a period drama, near technicians in ordinary work clothes, near child performers accompanied by studio-required tutors and guardians, all sharing the same limited window of time before the afternoon's work resumed. The presence of child performers on these lots introduced a set of considerations distinct from those governing adult contract players, and it is worth treating this subject with the seriousness it deserves. California law required that children employed in the entertainment industry receive a minimum number of hours of schooling each working day, typically administered by studio-employed tutors working in small on-set schoolrooms, and further required that a portion of a child performer's earnings be set aside in a protected trust account rather than made available to parents or guardians for immediate use. A legal protection that emerged specifically in response to documented cases in which the earnings of child performers had been mismanaged or entirely depleted by adult family members before the child reached adulthood. Despite these protections, the working conditions and pressures placed on child performers in this era remained considerably different from what later child labor and entertainment industry regulations would establish, and numerous former child stars of the period described, in later interviews and memoirs, a childhood substantially shaped by professional obligation, public scrutiny, and a level of adult responsibility placed on very young people that a modern understanding of child development would regard with considerable concern. Beyond the physical machinery of the lot itself, the studios maintained a set of relationships with the broader press and publicity apparatus of the era that shaped public perception of the industry as thoroughly as any film the studios actually produced. Gossip columnists occupied a position of genuine, and by later standards, somewhat startling influence over the industry during roughly the 1930s through the 1950s. Two columnists in particular achieved a level of national reach and industry influence that few journalists working in any field have matched before or since. Their columns syndicated across hundreds of newspapers and read daily by tens of millions of Americans, giving them the practical power to significantly help or seriously damage a performer's public reputation through the simple act of what they chose to report, how they chose to characterize it, and which unverified rumors they were willing to print as fact. Studios, keenly aware of this influence, cultivated careful relationships with these columnists, often providing them with exclusive access, advance information about upcoming productions or casting decisions, and a steady supply of publicity material in exchange for generally favorable coverage of the studio's contracted talent. Performers themselves frequently found it necessary to maintain cordial, even flattering relationships with these columnists as a matter of basic career self-preservation, understanding that a columnist's displeasure could translate into damaging coverage with genuine professional consequences, while a columnist's favor could provide valuable positive publicity difficult to obtain through any other channel. The rivalry between the era's most powerful columnists was itself a subject of considerable industry anxiety, since favoring one with an exclusive story risked alienating the other, placing performers and studio publicists alike in a delicate, ongoing diplomatic balancing act. This publicity apparatus operated in close, mutually reinforcing partnership with the fan magazine industry mentioned earlier, and together these institutions constructed and maintained a public narrative about Hollywood and its stars that diverged, often quite substantially, from the working reality documented in later historical research, studio records, and the personal accounts of performers themselves. Readers of these publications encountered a Hollywood defined by effortless glamour, romantic fulfillment, and material abundance, a narrative that served real commercial purposes for magazines dependent on studio cooperation for access and content, for studios dependent on maintaining public enthusiasm for their contracted stars, and for a Depression-era and later wartime readership for whom this glittering, aspirational fantasy offered a welcome, if largely fictional, escape from the genuine economic hardship many Americans were experiencing in their own lives during these same decades. It would be a mistake to view this dynamic purely cynically, since the emotional value this fantasy provided to its audience was, in its own way, real and meaningful, even though the specific images and stories audiences consumed were frequently manufactured, with considerably more editorial intervention than readers of the period generally understood. When genuine crises did arise within this carefully managed system, whether an automobile accident, a public altercation, a legal difficulty, or any other event that risked exposing the gap between a performer's manufactured public image and a messier private reality, studios employed publicity specialists whose specific function involved managing precisely these situations, working to minimize press coverage, negotiate with law enforcement, and, where necessary, arrange financial settlements with any parties involved in order to prevent a damaging story from reaching print at all. This function, while rarely documented with the same level of detail available for other aspects of studio operations, given its inherently discreet nature, is corroborated across numerous biographical accounts, studio memoirs, and later journalistic investigations into the era, and it represents one of the more ethically fraught dimensions of how the studio system operated. Since the priority in these situations was consistently the protection of the studio's commercial interests and the performer's public image, rather than any broader public accountability for whatever underlying incident had actually occurred. It is also necessary, in giving an honest account of this era, to address directly a further and more troubling dimension of the power imbalance embedded throughout the studio system: the vulnerability the system created for young performers, particularly young women with limited leverage, career security, or independent resources, working within an industry structure where a small number of powerful executives and producers controlled nearly every meaningful professional opportunity. Historical and journalistic investigation conducted across subsequent decades, including substantial research and reporting that intensified considerably in more recent years, has documented that this concentration of unchecked power did, in a considerable number of cases, enable serious abuse of that power by individuals in positions of authority over aspiring and established performers alike. The absence during this era of the kind of formal reporting mechanisms, legal protections, and organized labor advocacy that later decades would develop meant that performers who experienced this kind of abuse had extremely limited recourse, and the same publicity and reputation management apparatus that protected the industry's public image in other contexts functioned, in these cases, to suppress accounts of misconduct rather than address it. This is a genuinely dark undercurrent running through the history of this period, one that deserves acknowledgement as a real and serious dimension of how the industry operated, even as the specific details of individual cases remain, in many instances, difficult to establish with full historical certainty, given the deliberate suppression of contemporaneous documentation. The social life that surrounded the working demands of the studio system carried its own particular character, shaped significantly by the fact that, for many contract players, socializing itself functioned as an extension of professional obligation rather than genuine leisure. Industry parties, film premieres, and other high-visibility social gatherings served real business purposes, providing opportunities for producers and directors to observe potential casting choices in an informal setting, for columnists to gather material, and for performers to maintain the public visibility their studios expected of them. Attendance at these events, while rarely mandated in the explicit language of a studio contract, carried strong implicit professional expectation, and a contract player who consistently avoided the social circuit risked being perceived, whether fairly or not, as difficult, uncooperative, or insufficiently invested in the public dimension of their own career. Alcohol flowed freely at these gatherings, consistent with broader American social customs of the period following the end of Prohibition in 1933, and for performers already managing the physical demands of studio production schedules, sometimes including the stimulant and sedative regimens discussed earlier. The addition of regular social drinking created, for a documented number of individuals across the era, an additional layer of risk to both physical health and professional reliability, contributing in some well-documented cases to the kind of personal and professional decline that later biographical accounts of the period frequently describe. A further chapter in the history of this era, arriving somewhat later than most of what has been described so far, deserves careful and accurate treatment given how significantly it reshaped the working lives of everyone in the industry during the years it unfolded. In the years following the Second World War, amid the broader anxieties of the emerging Cold War, a congressional committee turned its investigative attention to the entertainment industry, driven by concerns, genuine in the minds of some of its members and considerably more opportunistic in the case of others, that Communist Party influence within the industry posed a meaningful threat to American political life. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing through much of the following decade, this investigation and the broader political climate surrounding it produced what came to be known as the entertainment industry blacklist, a largely informal but remarkably effective mechanism through which individuals suspected of Communist Party membership, past political associations considered suspect, or simply insufficient cooperation with congressional investigators found themselves unable to obtain work at any major studio, regardless of their professional talent or previous box office success. The mechanics of the blacklist operated through a combination of formal congressional testimony, private industry blacklisting publications that circulated names of individual studios were advised not to employ, and a climate of pervasive suspicion that led some individuals, faced with the investigators' demand that they name others whom they knew or suspected of Communist Party involvement, to provide such names in order to protect their own careers. A practice that inflicted lasting damage on personal and professional relationships across the industry, and that remains, in retrospect, one of the more morally fraught chapters in this entire history. The studios themselves, rather than defending employees facing investigation or accusation, generally moved quickly to distance themselves from anyone whose name appeared connected to the controversy, reflecting the same underlying institutional priority that had shaped so much of the studio system's behavior throughout this era. The protection of commercial interests and public reputation above any other consideration, including the well-being and due process rights of the individuals whose careers and livelihoods hung in the balance. A number of talented writers, directors, and performers found their careers seriously damaged or effectively ended by this process, with some able to continue working only under pseudonyms or through considerable professional subterfuge. And the full human cost of this period, in terms of careers ended, relationships destroyed, and lives seriously disrupted, was substantial and is well documented in subsequent historical scholarship. Even as these internal and external pressures shaped the daily working reality of the studio system throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s, a set of broader economic and legal forces was gradually building toward a transformation that would eventually dismantle the studio system in the specific, tightly integrated form it had taken across these decades. The vertical integration that had given the major studios their extraordinary market power, controlling production, distribution, and exhibition all within a single corporate structure, drew increasing legal scrutiny from federal antitrust regulators beginning in the late 1930s. And this scrutiny culminated in a landmark Supreme Court decision in 1948 that found this structure violated federal antitrust law and required the major studios to divest their theater chains, severing the direct ownership link between the companies that made films and the theaters where those films were shown. This decision, combined with the rapid post-war expansion of television, which offered American audiences an increasingly compelling alternative to a trip to the movie theater, and which drew away a significant portion of the audience the studios had relied upon, fundamentally altered the economic foundations on which the studio system had been built. The consequences of these combined pressures unfolded gradually rather than as a single dramatic collapse, and it is worth tracing that gradual unwinding carefully, because the transition away from the classic studio system did not happen overnight and did not affect every studio, every performer, or every department of the industry in the same way or at the same pace. The 1948 antitrust decision required the major studios to separate their production and distribution operations from their theater holdings over a period of years rather than immediately, and the practical process of divestiture stretched across much of the following decade. As the guaranteed exhibition outlet that studio-owned theater chains had once provided disappeared, studios found themselves needing to compete more directly for theater bookings on a film-by-film basis, which shifted commercial incentives away from the steady, high-volume production of moderately budgeted pictures that had characterized the studio system at its height, and toward a smaller number of larger, more expensive productions designed to stand out as major events capable of drawing audiences away from their increasingly popular home television sets. This shift had direct and substantial consequences for the contract system that had defined the working lives of performers for decades. A business model built around a smaller number of larger productions required fewer contracted performers working on a continuous basis, and the enormous overhead cost of maintaining large rosters of contract players, along with the extensive training, publicity, and support infrastructure the studios had built around them, became increasingly difficult to justify as production volume declined, and as the reliable profit margins the old system had guaranteed began to erode. Studios began allowing long-term contracts to lapse rather than renewing them, shifted toward negotiating individual project-by-project agreements with performers and their now increasingly influential independent agents, and gradually dismantled much of the elaborate internal infrastructure, the dedicated training departments, the large publicity staffs, the standing wardrobe and set-building operations that had defined the studio system's particular way of organizing the business of making films. This transition also coincided with, and was accelerated by, a shift in the broader legal and professional landscape governing the relationship between performers and the studios that employed them. The Screen Actors Guild, established in 1933, specifically in response to the working conditions and contractual imbalances that had characterized the earliest years of the sound era, had spent the intervening decades gradually building organizational strength and negotiating increasingly substantial protections for its members, including limits on working hours, minimum rest periods between shooting days, minimum compensation standards, and eventually, though this development extended somewhat beyond the classic studio era itself, residual payments for the reuse of filmed work in new distribution formats such as television syndication, an issue that became increasingly significant as older studio-era films found a lucrative second life on the rapidly expanding medium of television throughout the 1950s. The growing influence of talent agencies, which had existed in more limited form throughout the studio era, but which expanded considerably in both size and negotiating power as the old contract system weakened, further shifted the balance of leverage away from the studios and toward performers and the professional representatives now negotiating on their behalf. Representing an important structural change from the earlier decades in which a performer's own studio had often functioned simultaneously as employer, career manager, and through its exclusive contractual control, the primary determinant of that performer's entire professional trajectory. It would be worth pausing here to consider more specifically how the daily working life of the industry's less visible personnel, the enormous population of skilled tradespeople, technicians, and craftspeople, who made the actual physical production of a film possible, differed from the experience of contracted performers. Since the popular imagination of Golden Age Hollywood, understandably, tends to center on the stars themselves, while giving considerably less attention to the far larger population of working people, whose labor the industry depended upon just as fundamentally. A major studio in full production employed, across its various departments, carpenters, plasterers, and painters who built and dressed sets, often working from detailed architectural drawings prepared by a dedicated art department responsible for designing every visual environment a production required. Costume departments employed pattern makers, seamstresses, and tailors, some specializing in historical accuracy for period productions requiring detailed research into the clothing of a given era, and others focused on the more purely aesthetic demands of contemporary fashion-forward productions, intended to influence and reflect current styles. Makeup and hairstyling departments employed specialists who developed genuinely innovative techniques throughout this period, including specialized prosthetic and special effects makeup techniques that pushed the boundaries of what film could depict. Developed initially for period pieces, fantasy productions, and the horror genre that flourished at several studios throughout the 1930s and beyond. Camera departments employed cinematographers and their crews of camera operators, focus pullers, and loaders, a technical hierarchy with its own internal apprenticeship structure through which young technicians worked their way up over years of practical experience toward the more senior and better compensated positions. Sound departments, an entirely new and rapidly professionalizing specialty following the industry's conversion to synchronized sound in the late 1920s, employed engineers responsible for the technically demanding work of recording clean dialogue and sound effects under the primitive and often finicky recording technology available in the earliest years of the sound era, a technical challenge that shaped filmmaking practice considerably during the transition period. Since early sound cameras required substantial soundproofing that limited camera mobility, and early microphones picked up unwanted ambient noise with a sensitivity that required considerable ingenuity to work around. Editorial departments employed film editors, at this point in film history working with physical strips of celluloid film that had to be manually cut and spliced together on specialized equipment, a painstaking, skilled craft quite different from the digital editing processes of later decades, requiring editors to develop an almost intuitive sense of packing and rhythm, while working with physical materials that made experimentation considerably more time-consuming than it would later become. Music departments employed composers, orchestrators, and musicians, many of the era's most accomplished composers working under studio contract in circumstances not entirely dissimilar to those governing performers, producing original orchestral scores for dozens of productions across a career, often under demanding deadlines that required extraordinary compositional speed and versatility. The working conditions and compensation for this enormous population of craft and technical workers varied considerably by department, by studio, and by the individual's position within their particular craft's internal hierarchy. But broadly speaking, these workers occupied a somewhat different position within the studio system than contracted performers did. Unlike performers, whose value to the studio was tied specifically to their individual public identity and marketability, technical and craft workers were valued primarily for their professional skill and reliability, and many of the specialized craft unions representing camera operators, editors, and other technical specialties achieved meaningful collective bargaining power and negotiated working condition protections considerably earlier than the Screen Actors Guild managed to establish comparable protections for performers, reflecting the somewhat different labor relations dynamics at play in an industry where technical crews had, in some cases, organized collectively even before the studio system reached its full institutional maturity in the 1920s and 1930s. That said, the same demanding production schedules, long working days, and pressure to complete productions on tight timelines that shaped the experience of contracted performers applied with equal force to the technical crews working alongside them. And the physical toll of the work, whether the heat of studio lighting, the physical labor of set construction, or the eye strain and precision demands of film editing, represented a genuine occupational reality for tens of thousands of skilled workers whose names rarely appeared in the fan magazines, but whose collective labor made the entire enterprise possible. Consider also the particular economics of how a studio actually functioned as a business enterprise during this period, since understanding the financial logic underlying the system helps explain many of the specific practices already described. A major studio operating at the height of the classic system in the 1930s and into the 1940s functioned, in essence, as a factory optimized for the continuous, predictable production of a standardized product delivered to a guaranteed distribution network. Studios typically produced dozens of feature films annually, a volume of output that would seem extraordinary by the standards of any major studio operating today. And this required a highly organized, almost industrial approach to scheduling, resource allocation, and creative decision-making that differed considerably from the more artisanal, film-by-film approach that would characterize the industry in later decades. Production schedules were planned months or even years in advance. Contracted performers and technical staff were assigned to specific projects according to a centrally managed production calendar. And the entire apparatus of the studio, from its standing sets and permanent technical staff to its stable of contracted creative talent, was designed to keep this continuous production pipeline running as efficiently and predictably as possible. This factory-like organizational logic extended to the way studios approached the creative development of their films as well. Scripts moved through a structured development process involving staff writers, story editors, and producers responsible for shepherding a project from initial concept through to a shooting script ready for production. And while individual directors and cinematographers certainly brought distinctive personal style and skill to their work within this system, and some achieved genuine creative autonomy and recognition as artists working within the studio structure, the overall organizational logic of the system placed considerably more emphasis on reliable, efficient production of commercially viable entertainment than on individual creative autonomy for its own sake. This is part of why film historians and critics writing in later decades often describe the studio era as operating according to a producer-driven system, in contrast to the director-driven or auteur-oriented model that would become more prominent in American filmmaking from the late 1960s onward, reflecting a genuinely different underlying philosophy about how creative authority and responsibility for a finished film ought to be organized and distributed among the many people involved in making it. The particular genres and production categories that dominated studio output throughout these decades reflected this same underlying commercial logic, with studios developing considerable expertise in producing efficient, reliably profitable pictures within established generic categories that audiences had demonstrated a consistent appetite for. Westerns remained a staple of American film production throughout this era, ranging from lavishly budgeted prestige productions to the more modestly resourced B-westerns churned out at a rapid pace by both major studios and the smaller Poverty Row companies to fill the lower half of the double feature programs that were standard practice at American theaters throughout much of this period. Musicals flourished particularly from the early 1930s onward, once the technical challenges of synchronized sound recording had been sufficiently resolved to allow for the elaborate production numbers the genre demanded, and several studios developed particular reputations for excellence in this genre, building dedicated choreography, music, and dance departments capable of producing the elaborate, technically demanding sequences the genre required. Horror and mystery pictures found a particularly enthusiastic and durable audience throughout the 1930s and into subsequent decades, with certain studios building substantial reputations and lasting cultural influence around a relatively modest investment in atmospheric, moderately budgeted productions that proved consistently profitable given their comparatively low production costs relative to their box office return. Historical and costume dramas, requiring the kind of elaborate wardrobe and set-building resources described earlier, represented some of the most expensive and prestigious productions any given studio might undertake in a given year, often positioned as the centerpiece of a studio's annual release slate, and frequently the vehicle through which a studio's most prominent contracted stars were showcased to greatest advantage. The audience experience of moviegoing during this period deserves equal attention to the production side of the industry, because the two were deeply intertwined, and the particular way Americans consumed films throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s shaped studio decision-making just as fundamentally as anything happening on a soundstage. A trip to the movies in this era looked considerably different from the experience later generations would come to expect. Rather than a single feature film shown at a scheduled start time, the standard theatrical program throughout most of this period consisted of what was known as a double feature, typically pairing a major studio's higher budget, more heavily promoted picture with a second, more modestly produced film, often supplied by one of the smaller studios or by a major studio's own lower-budget production unit, specifically established to generate this secondary content. This double feature format, which became standard practice during the economic pressures of the Depression, as theater owners sought to offer audiences more perceived value for a single ticket price, created substantial demand for a steady supply of efficiently produced, moderately budgeted pictures. And it was this demand that sustained much of the Poverty Row production sector and the B-picture units operating within the major studios themselves. Surrounding these two feature films, a typical theatrical program in this era included a range of additional short-form content that has largely disappeared from the modern moviegoing experience. Newsreels, brief filmed news summaries typically running around 10 minutes, provided many Americans with their primary visual exposure to current events, since television news would not become a widespread alternative until the following decades. And these newsreels took on particular significance during the Second World War, when they represented one of the only ways ordinary American audiences could see moving images of the war effort, whether footage from overseas battlefronts, domestic war production, or the various public information and propaganda content that both the newsreel companies and, at times, the federal government itself produced for wartime theatrical distribution. Animated cartoons, produced by dedicated animation studios and distributed alongside feature programming, represented their own substantial creative and commercial industry within the broader entertainment business, with several studios developing internationally recognized characters and a highly refined animation craft that would eventually mature into feature-length animated productions in its own right. Serial productions, presented in installments across successive weeks and typically featuring adventure, science fiction, or Western narratives structured around a cliffhanger ending, intended to draw audiences back for the following week's chapter, provided another popular staple of the era's theatrical programming, particularly appealing to younger audiences attending the Saturday matinee showings that many theaters programmed specifically for children, often at discounted admission prices. The physical theaters where Americans experienced this programming varied enormously by size, location, and era of construction, ranging from the enormous, architecturally elaborate movie palaces built primarily during the 1920s in major American cities, structures designed with a level of ornamental grandeur, seating capacity, and architectural ambition that rivaled the great opera houses and concert halls of an earlier era, down to the far more modest neighborhood theaters and small-town single-screen cinemas that provided the primary movie-going venue for the great majority of American communities outside major urban centers. These movie palaces, with their elaborate lobbies, ornate ceiling work, and seating capacities that could run into the thousands, represented a conscious effort by theater owners and architects to position the movie-going experience as an accessible form of luxury and spectacle, offering ordinary working Americans, for the price of a single ticket, access to an environment of grandeur that would otherwise have been well beyond their ordinary means. A democratizing quality to the movie-going experience that contemporary observers frequently remarked upon, and that later cultural historians have identified as an important part of the broader social significance the movies held for Depression-era and wartime American audiences. Ticket prices throughout this period remained, relative to average household income, quite modest, a deliberate positioning that reflected the industry's understanding of movie-going as a mass entertainment product dependent on high-volume attendance rather than premium per-ticket pricing. And weekly movie-going was, for a very substantial portion of the American population throughout the 1930s and 1940s, a genuinely routine habit rather than an occasional special outing. With industry attendance figures for this period reflecting a level of per capita theatrical attendance that would seem extraordinary by later standards, once television had become the dominant vehicle for routine home entertainment. This high-frequency attendance pattern helps explain the studio's need to produce such a substantial annual volume of new feature films, since a regular weekly audience required a correspondingly steady supply of new programming to sustain their continued patronage, a commercial logic that directly shaped the industrial, high-volume production model described in the previous portion of this account. The Second World War itself represents a distinct and historically significant chapter within this broader account of the studio era, since the war years reshaped nearly every dimension of the industry's operation for the duration of American involvement in the conflict. Following the American entry into the war in December 1941, the film industry was formally organized, alongside numerous other American industries, into the broader national war effort, with a dedicated federal office established specifically to coordinate cooperation between the government and the entertainment industry regarding wartime content, messaging, and resource allocation. Raw film stock itself became a rationed material during the war, subject to government allocation limits that required studios to plan their production schedules with considerably more material efficiency than had been necessary in peacetime. And this material constraint, combined with the loss of a significant portion of the industry's younger male workforce, both performers and technical crew, to military service, required substantial adjustments to how studios organized their remaining production capacity. The content of American films during these years was also directly shaped by the war effort in ways that went well beyond the more general studio-era content regulations already discussed. Studios produced a substantial volume of films directly addressing the war, ranging from combat dramas depicting American and Allied military efforts, to films dramatizing the wartime experience of the home front, to more explicitly propagandistic content produced in direct cooperation with government agencies, and intended to bolster public morale, support for war bond drives, and general public commitment to the war effort. This wartime content served real government interests in shaping public opinion and morale, and the studios, for their part, generally cooperated enthusiastically with this arrangement, both from genuine patriotic sentiment shared by many industry figures, and from a clear-eyed commercial recognition that war-themed content held strong audience appeal throughout this period, when the war dominated nearly every dimension of American public life and consciousness. A number of the industry's contracted performers themselves entered military service during these years, some serving in combat roles and others assigned to specialized units producing training films, morale-building content, or participating in the extensive program of Celebrity War Bond Tour and camp entertainment appearances organized to support troop morale both domestically and for performers willing to travel into or near active theaters of conflict overseas. This period of direct wartime service represented, for a number of performers whose careers had been built entirely within the carefully managed and controlled environment of the studio system, a genuinely unusual departure from the professional and personal circumstances that had defined their working lives up to that point. And a number of later biographical accounts describe this wartime experience as personally significant and, in some cases, professionally transformative for the performers who lived through it. The wartime economic environment also proved, somewhat counterintuitively given the material constraints and workforce disruptions already described, to be a period of substantial financial success for the film industry as a whole. Wartime full employment and wage growth in many sectors of the American economy, combined with rationing that limited consumer spending on many other categories of goods, left many American households with more available discretionary income to spend on affordable entertainment than they had possessed during the preceding years of Depression-era economic hardship, and theatrical attendance and industry revenue during the war years reflected this shift, with the period representing, by several standard industry measures, one of the most commercially successful stretches in the studio system's entire history, even as the industry simultaneously navigated the substantial operational disruptions the war itself had introduced. Following the war's conclusion in 1945, the industry entered what would prove, in retrospect, to be both a final period of peak commercial success and the beginning of the structural transformation that would eventually dismantle the classic studio system in the form it had taken across the preceding 2 decades. The immediate post-war years, 1946 in particular, represent by several historical measures the high-water mark of American theatrical attendance, with a substantial portion of the American population attending films on a weekly basis and industry revenues reaching levels that would not be matched again, in terms of relative audience share of American entertainment spending, for many decades afterward. This peak proved short-lived, however, as the convergence of forces already discussed, the 1948 antitrust decision requiring divestiture of studio-owned theater chains, the rapid post-war expansion of television, as first thousands and then millions of American households acquired television sets throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Broader demographic shifts as returning veterans and their new families moved to the expanding suburbs in numbers that reshaped American residential patterns, and with them, patterns of entertainment consumption, and the general economic and cultural transformations of post-war American life, combined to produce a sustained, multi-decade decline in theatrical attendance that fundamentally altered the commercial foundation on which the classic studio system had been built. Studios responded to this declining attendance and the loss of guaranteed theatrical exhibition through their former theater chains, with a range of strategies aimed at differentiating the theatrical movie-going experience from what audiences could now obtain at home through television. Widescreen projection formats, offering a dramatically larger and more visually immersive image than the standard aspect ratio that had defined theatrical presentation throughout the preceding decades, were introduced and heavily promoted during the 1950s as a distinctly theatrical experience television could not replicate. Stereophonic sound systems, three-dimensional film technology, though this particular innovation proved to have more limited and shorter-lived commercial success than widescreen formats, and a general shift toward larger-scale, more visually spectacular production values for major studio releases, all reflected this same underlying strategic response to the competitive threat television represented. An industry-wide effort to offer audiences an experience sufficiently distinct from and superior to home television, viewing to justify the continued expense and effort of a trip to the theater. The particular genre of the historical epic, featuring large-scale historical or biblical narratives, elaborate location shooting, enormous supporting casts, and production budgets considerably larger than had been typical even for major studios' most prestigious productions during the classic studio era, flourished throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s as one of the industry's principal responses to television competition, offering audiences a scale and visual spectacle that home television of this period simply could not match technically or financially. These productions, while commercially successful in a number of prominent cases, also represented a considerably higher-risk production model than the studio system's earlier approach of steady, high-volume production of moderately budgeted films, since a single enormous production failure now carried the potential to inflict serious financial damage on a studio in a way that had been considerably less likely under the earlier system's more diversified, higher-volume production strategy. And this shift toward fewer, larger, higher-risk productions represents one of the clearest structural markers of the industry's transition away from the classic studio system model that had defined it for the preceding several decades. The men who ran these studios deserve their own careful examination, because their personalities, management philosophies, and personal histories shaped the culture of their respective companies in ways that rippled down through every level of the organizations they controlled. Nearly all of the founding generation of major studio executives shared a broadly similar biographical arc. Immigrants or the children of immigrants, many from Eastern European Jewish families who had arrived in the United States in the late 19th or early 20th century, who had entered the entertainment business not through any formal training in filmmaking or the arts, but through humbler commercial ventures, running Nickelodeons, operating small theater chains, or working in garment or fur trades before recognizing, earlier than many of their contemporaries, the commercial potential of the still new medium of motion pictures. This shared background produced a particular management culture across the industry, one built on hands-on, highly personal control rather than the more diffuse, professionally managed corporate structures that would characterize the industry in later decades. And it is worth understanding this culture in some detail, because it explains a great deal about how decisions affecting individual performers and productions actually got made. A studio head in this era typically exercised direct, personal authority over an enormous range of decisions that a modern studio executive would delegate to specialized departments or subordinate executives. Final approval over casting decisions, personal review of scripts, and even individual scenes within them. Direct involvement in publicity strategy for the studio's major stars, and often a degree of personal involvement in the private lives and conduct of contracted performers that would seem extraordinarily intrusive by later professional standards. This intensely personal management style produced working relationships between studio heads and their contracted performers that varied enormously depending on the specific individuals involved, ranging from genuinely supportive, almost paternal relationships in which a studio head took real interest in a performer's long-term career development and well-being, to considerably more exploitative and controlling dynamics in which a performer's individual needs and preferences were subordinated almost entirely to the studio head's own commercial judgment and personal authority. The historical record, drawn from numerous memoirs, biographies, and contemporaneous accounts, documents examples across this entire spectrum, and it would be a mistake to flatten the genuine variation in how different studio heads exercised the considerable power their position afforded them. The internal culture of a major studio during this period also reflected the particular creative and commercial identity that its leadership had cultivated over years of consistent decision-making, and audiences of the era, along with the industry's own trade press, developed a fairly sophisticated understanding of how one major studio's output and public identity differed from another's. An understanding roughly analogous to how modern audiences might distinguish between different television networks or streaming services based on their characteristic programming and creative sensibility. Some studios built reputations around glossy, sophisticated productions and a particular emphasis on female stars and women's pictures, dramas centered on female protagonists navigating romantic, family, or professional challenges, a genre category that commanded a substantial and reliable audience throughout this period, and that gave a number of the era's most accomplished actresses some of their most significant and enduring roles. Other studios built their identity more around a particular house style of tough, urban, socially conscious drama, often addressing contemporary social problems, criminal justice, and working-class experience with a grittier visual and narrative sensibility than the more polished, escapist fare associated with some of their competitors. Still others specialized in the kind of wholesome, family-oriented entertainment, animated features, and elaborately produced musicals that built a reputation for technical craft and imaginative visual spectacle that would prove particularly durable and influential across the following decades. This differentiation in creative identity was not simply an aesthetic matter, but reflected genuine underlying differences in business strategy, target audience, and the particular kind of talent, both performing and technical, that each studio sought to cultivate and retain under long-term contract. A performer whose particular skills and screen persona fit well within one studio's characteristic house style might have found their career considerably more successful and satisfying there than they would have at a competing studio with a different creative identity and a different set of commercial priorities, which helps explain why the specific studio a young performer happened to sign with. A decision often shaped as much by circumstance, and which studio happened to be looking for new talent at a given moment as by any careful strategic choice on the performer's part, could exercise such a profound and lasting influence over the entire subsequent trajectory of that performer's career. The relationship between these competing studios, while genuinely adversarial in commercial terms, with each company competing vigorously for box office revenue, prestige, and the services of the industry's most valuable creative talent, also involved a considerable degree of coordinated behavior on matters where the major studios shared common interests. A pattern of behavior that later drew sustained scrutiny from federal antitrust regulators, and that ultimately contributed to the 1948 legal decision discussed earlier. Beyond the informal understanding not to actively poach one another's contracted performers already mentioned, the major studios coordinated closely through their shared trade association on matters of industry-wide content regulation, on collective responses to labor organizing efforts by performers and technical workers, and on maintaining the broader structural arrangements, including the theater exhibition practices and distribution agreements, that sustained the industry's overall commercial model throughout this period. This combination of vigorous individual competition, alongside substantial collective coordination on matters of shared institutional interest, represents an important and somewhat paradoxical feature of how the studio-era industry actually functioned. One that helps explain both the intense creative and commercial rivalry visible in the industry's public competitive behavior and the remarkably consistent underlying structure, evident across nearly every major studio, that governed how contracted performers and technical workers actually experienced their working lives within the system. As the classic studio system entered its extended decline through the 1950s, a new organizational model gradually emerged to take its place, one built around independent production rather than the centralized, vertically integrated studio structure that had defined the preceding decades. Independent producers, often financed through arrangements with the major studios, but operating with considerably more autonomy over individual projects than the old system's centralized production planning had allowed, began assembling talent and financing on a project-by-project basis, rather than drawing exclusively from a studio's own roster of long-term contracted performers and staff. This shift proved particularly significant for performers, since it meant that the star performers who continued working successfully through this transitional period increasingly negotiated individual contracts for specific projects, often with considerably more favorable financial terms, including a share of a film's profits rather than simply a fixed salary, than the old long-term studio contract system had typically afforded. Reflecting the substantially increased negotiating leverage that established stars now possessed, once talent agencies and independent production had displaced the old system's concentrated studio authority over performers' careers. Television itself, initially regarded by much of the film industry establishment as a direct commercial threat to be resisted, and, where possible, actively undermined, gradually became instead an important new outlet for both established and aspiring performers, as the demand for programming to fill the rapidly expanding schedules of American television networks created substantial new employment opportunities throughout the 1950s. A number of performers whose film careers had declined or stalled as the classic studio system contracted found renewed professional success in television, and the medium's voracious appetite for content. Network television in this period required a volume of original programming considerably exceeding what any comparable film production schedule had ever demanded, created opportunities for both established performers and a new generation of talent that would come to define the following decades of American popular entertainment. Some of the major film studios themselves, initially resistant to what they perceived as a direct competitive threat, gradually recognized the commercial opportunity television represented and began producing television content directly, either through dedicated television production divisions or through licensing arrangements that made their extensive libraries of older studio-era films available for television broadcast. A development that introduced many of the era's classic productions to new generations of viewers who would never have encountered them through their original theatrical release, and that provided studios with a valuable new revenue stream from a back catalog of productions that had, in many cases, already recouped their original production costs many times over during their initial theatrical run. The question of who actually appeared on American movie screens during this period, and under what circumstances, deserves direct and honest treatment as its own subject, because the racial and ethnic composition of the studio era's visible talent, both in front of and behind the camera, reflected the broader discriminatory structures of American society during these decades in ways that shaped the industry as profoundly as any of the economic or organizational factors already discussed. Throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, the major studios operated under a set of largely unwritten but remarkably consistent practices that severely restricted meaningful opportunities for black performers, other performers of color, and performers from various immigrant and ethnic backgrounds, considered outside the narrow range of appearance the studios judged commercially marketable to mainstream white American audiences, a restriction that operated alongside and was reinforced by the broader system of legal segregation and social discrimination that governed American life throughout this same period. Black performers working in this era found themselves confined, with only occasional and hard-won exceptions, to a narrow range of roles, frequently subordinate domestic or comedic parts that reflected and reinforced the demeaning racial stereotypes pervasive throughout mainstream American culture at the time, rather than roles that reflected anything approaching the full range of human experience and complexity that white performers were regularly afforded. A number of genuinely talented black performers of this era achieved real individual recognition, and, in a small number of notable cases, historically significant milestones, including the first Academy Award won by a black performer, awarded in the early 1940s for a supporting role, even as the broader structural conditions of the industry continued to deny black performers anything resembling equal opportunity or creative range. It is worth noting, in the interest of historical accuracy, that the specific film for which this award-winning performance was given has itself become the subject of extensive and serious historical criticism in subsequent decades for its romanticized and historically inaccurate depiction of the antebellum South and of slavery. A criticism that illustrates the broader pattern in which even the industry's rare moments of individual recognition for black talent frequently occurred within productions that themselves perpetuated deeply harmful historical narratives and racial stereotypes. Beyond the constrained range of roles available, black performers working within the studio system faced practical working conditions shaped directly by the broader segregation that governed American public life during this period. Black performers working on location shoots in southern states, where legal segregation was enforced under state law, frequently faced separate and inferior accommodations, transportation, and dining arrangements from their white co-stars and crew members, a reality documented in numerous later accounts by performers and industry professionals who lived through this era. Even within the more cosmopolitan environment of Hollywood itself, black performers and other industry professionals of color frequently encountered discriminatory practices in housing, restaurant service, and general social access that white performers, regardless of their own personal views on racial matters, simply did not have to navigate as part of their daily professional and personal lives. Performers and filmmakers of Asian, Latino, and Native American heritage faced their own particular and distinct patterns of exclusion and stereotyping throughout this period, frequently confined to roles that traded heavily in ethnic caricature, and Hollywood productions throughout these decades routinely cast white performers in makeup and costuming, intended to represent Asian, Latino, Native American, and other non-white characters. A practice that later generations of critics and historians have examined with considerable and warranted scrutiny, since it reflected both the industry's narrow assumptions about which performers' audiences would accept in leading roles and a broader unwillingness to provide genuine opportunities to the performers of color who might otherwise have been cast in these parts. It should be noted that this practice was not universal or absolute throughout the era, and a number of performers of Asian and Latino heritage did achieve significant, if still often constrained, careers within the studio system, navigating an industry that afforded them considerably narrower opportunities and a considerably more limited range of roles than their white contemporaries, while still, in a number of documented cases, building substantial and influential careers despite these structural obstacles. Jewish performers and industry professionals occupied a more complicated position within this broader landscape of exclusion, since, as already discussed, a very substantial proportion of the industry's founding studio executives were themselves Jewish immigrants or the children of Jewish immigrants, giving the industry's ownership and executive leadership a demographic composition that stood in notable contrast to the broader patterns of anti-Semitic exclusion present throughout much of American business and social life during this period. This did not mean, however, that the industry itself was free of the era's pervasive antisemitism, and a number of Jewish performers found it professionally advantageous, or, in some documented cases, felt genuine pressure to adopt less identifiably Jewish stage names as part of the broader studio practice of constructing more broadly marketable public identities already discussed earlier in this account. A pattern that reflected the studio's calculated commercial judgment about what identities would prove most acceptable to a mainstream American audience during an era when anti-Semitic prejudice remained a significant and largely unchallenged feature of broader American social attitudes. The gradual, halting expansion of opportunity for performers of color within the American film industry unfolded across subsequent decades following the classic studio era, shaped by the broader civil rights movement and by evolving social attitudes throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond, a process that extends considerably beyond the chronological scope of this particular account of the Golden Age studio system itself. But that is worth acknowledging here as necessary context for understanding both the genuine limitations of the era being described and the longer historical process through which the American film industry gradually, and still by many measures incompletely, worked to address these limitations in the decades that followed, turning to a somewhat different dimension of daily life within this industry. It is worth considering the particular economic and social ecosystem that grew up around Hollywood and the broader Los Angeles area specifically because of the film industry's presence there, since the industry's economic footprint extended well beyond the studios themselves into a broad range of ancillary businesses and professional services that depended on the industry's continued operation. Specialized restaurants, some quite famous within industry circles as gathering places where deals were negotiated over lunch, and where a hopeful young performer might, with sufficient luck, catch the attention of an important producer or agent dining nearby, became fixtures of Hollywood's professional social geography. Specialized retail businesses catering to the industry's particular needs, costume rental houses, prop suppliers, specialized photography studios producing the professional headshots and publicity photographs that every working performer required, and a substantial legal and accounting profession that developed particular expertise in the specialized contractual and financial arrangements characteristic of entertainment industry work. All grew up around the core studio business to form a broader regional economy substantially shaped by the film industry's presence. Real estate development in the greater Los Angeles area during this period was itself substantially influenced by the film industry's presence and by the particular residential patterns that successful industry professionals established as they achieved financial success. Certain neighborhoods and, somewhat later, certain areas further from the historic center of the industry developed reputations as preferred residential areas for successful performers, directors, and executives, with distinctive architectural styles and increasingly substantial property values that reflected the concentration of considerable entertainment industry wealth in these particular areas. This pattern of residential development, driven by an industry whose economic fortunes were tied to a national and international audience, but whose actual production activity remained geographically concentrated in this relatively compact region of Southern California, contributed substantially to the broader transformation of Los Angeles from a relatively modest regional city in the early 20th century into one of the major metropolitan centers of the United States by the middle of the century, a transformation in which the film industry, alongside other major growth sectors including aerospace manufacturing that expanded dramatically during and after the Second World War, played a genuinely central role. The radio industry, flourishing as the dominant American home entertainment medium throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s before television gradually displaced it in this role during the following decade, maintained a close and mutually reinforcing relationship with the film industry throughout this period, one worth understanding as part of the broader entertainment ecosystem within which the studio system operated. Major film stars frequently made paid appearances on popular radio programs, sometimes reprising film roles in adapted radio versions of popular pictures, sometimes appearing on variety and comedy programs in a more informal capacity that allowed radio audiences to experience something closer to a performer's actual personality rather than a scripted film role. And these radio appearances served real promotional value for the performer's ongoing film career, while also providing meaningful additional income during a period when a performer's studio salary, as already discussed, often failed to reflect their actual market value and box office drawing power. Studios themselves recognized and actively cultivated this cross-promotional relationship, frequently negotiating and, in some cases, directly arranging radio appearances for their contracted stars as part of the broader publicity strategy surrounding a major film release, understanding that radio's enormous national reach, reaching into the great majority of American households by the late 1930s, provided an invaluable promotional platform that complemented the print-based publicity apparatus of newspapers and fan magazines already discussed in detail earlier in this account. The screenwriters who supplied the raw material for this enormous annual output of feature films occupied their own distinctive and, in a number of important respects, disadvantaged position within the studio hierarchy. One worth examining in detail because the writing profession's particular working conditions during this era shaped the content audiences ultimately saw on screen in ways that are not always immediately visible when considering the industry, primarily through the more publicly visible lens of its performers. Studios during the height of the classic system typically employed substantial staffs of contracted writers, sometimes numbering in the dozens at a single major studio, working under arrangements that bore certain structural similarities to the performer contract system already described in detail, including fixed salaries, exclusive commitment to a single studio, and limited individual control over which projects a given writer would be assigned to work on. The organizational structure through which a script actually moved from initial concept to finished shooting script reflected the same factory-like production logic that characterized the broader studio system. A story department, typically staffed by story editors and readers, whose job involved evaluating potential source material, whether original story pitches, existing novels and plays under consideration for adaptation, or news events and historical subjects that seemed to hold commercial potential, would identify promising projects and assign them to one or more contracted writers for initial script development. It was quite common during this era for multiple writers to work sequentially or even simultaneously on the same project, an arrangement that could produce genuinely collaborative improvement of a script through successive drafts, but that could equally produce considerable professional frustration for individual writers whose original work might be substantially rewritten by subsequent writers assigned to the same project, sometimes without the earlier writer's knowledge or consent, and whose eventual screen credit, determined through arbitration procedures established by the Writers Guild once that organization achieved meaningful bargaining power in the industry, might or might not accurately reflect their actual creative contribution to the finished film. This somewhat impersonal, assembly line approach to script development reflected the studio's underlying institutional priority, already evident throughout so much of this broader account, of maintaining reliable, predictable production output over any particular commitment to individual creative authorship or artistic vision for its own sake. It is worth noting, in fairness to this system, that it did produce, across the many thousands of scripts developed under these conditions throughout the studio era, a substantial body of genuinely accomplished, sophisticated, and enduringly popular screenwriting, and a number of individual writers achieved considerable professional recognition, and in some cases, real creative influence within the system despite its generally impersonal organizational structure, suggesting that talented individuals could and did find ways to exercise meaningful creative agency, even within an institutional framework, not particularly designed to prioritize or protect that agency as a matter of course. Directors occupied a somewhat different, generally more elevated position within the studio hierarchy than either performers or writers, though the degree of creative autonomy any individual director actually possessed varied enormously depending on their particular standing within a given studio, their track record of commercial success, and the specific production they had been assigned to direct. A director working on a major studio's most prestigious, highest-budget productions, particularly one who had established a substantial track record of critical and commercial success, might exercise considerable creative authority over casting input, visual style, and the overall approach to a production, developing over the course of a career a recognizable personal style that audiences and critics came to associate specifically with that director's work. Notwithstanding the broader studio system's general institutional preference for producer-driven decision-making already discussed, a director working on more routine, lower-budget studio assignments, by contrast, often functioned in a considerably more constrained capacity, expected to execute an already largely determined production plan efficiently and on schedule rather than to exercise substantial independent creative judgment, reflecting the same fundamental distinction in working conditions and creative latitude that separated the industry's most prominent. Established talent from the far larger population of working professionals whose contributions, while essential to the industry's overall functioning, rarely received comparable public recognition or professional autonomy. The relationship between a studio's producers, who typically held primary responsibility for a production's budget, schedule, and overall commercial strategy, and the directors nominally responsible for its actual creative execution, could prove genuinely collaborative and productive in many documented cases. With skilled producers providing valuable practical guidance and institutional support that allowed talented directors to do their best work within the studio's commercial constraints. This relationship could equally prove a significant source of creative frustration in cases where a producer's commercial judgment diverged substantially from a director's own creative instincts, and the studio system's institutional structure generally afforded producers, backed by the ultimate authority of the studio head, considerably more leverage in resolving such disagreements than individual directors, particularly less established ones, typically possessed. This dynamic occasionally resulted in a director being removed from a production partway through filming, or in a finished film being substantially re-edited by studio executives in ways that diverged significantly from the directing filmmaker's own creative intentions, a practice that became a significant point of ongoing professional grievance among the industry's directing community, and that contributed to the eventual formation of the Screen Directors Guild. Established in the mid-1930s, which worked over subsequent decades to establish greater professional protections and creative recognition for directors working within the studio system. The experience of moviegoing itself in smaller American communities, away from the major metropolitan centers where the industry's most elaborate movie palaces had been constructed, deserves its own brief consideration, since the great majority of the American population throughout this era lived in smaller towns and cities, where the local moviegoing experience differed considerably from the more elaborate urban theatrical environment already described. A small-town theater in this period typically operated on a considerably more modest scale than its big city counterparts, often independently owned rather than part of one of the major studio-affiliated theater chains, though these independent small-town theaters remained substantially dependent on distribution arrangements with the major studios for access to first-run and subsequent-run film content. The particular scheduling pattern through which a given film reached these smaller markets, typically weeks or even months after its initial release in major metropolitan first-run theaters, reflected the broader distribution system's tiered structure, in which a film moved progressively through successive tiers of theatrical exhibition, from prestigious first-run downtown theaters in major cities, through progressively less prestigious and lower-priced subsequent-run theaters. eventually reaching the smaller neighborhood and small-town theaters that constituted the final tier of a film's theatrical distribution run, with ticket prices and, correspondingly, a theater's share of box office revenue declining at each successive tier of this distribution hierarchy. For many small-town and rural American families throughout this period, particularly during the Depression years when discretionary spending on any form of entertainment required careful household budgeting, the local movie theater represented one of the relatively few affordable options for regular family entertainment and social gathering, and the weekly or twice-weekly trip to the local theater, often timed to coincide with a change in the theater's limited programming schedule, became an important and eagerly anticipated fixture of community social life in many American towns throughout these decades. Children's Saturday matinee programming, mentioned briefly earlier in connection with the era's popular serial productions, held particular significance in many of these smaller communities, providing a supervised, affordable form of entertainment that allowed parents a few hours of respite while offering children a genuinely exciting communal experience, watching adventure serials, cartoons, and age-appropriate feature content alongside dozens or hundreds of other neighborhood children in a shared theatrical environment. A distinctive and increasingly significant variation on the traditional theatrical experience emerged during the latter portion of this era in the form of the drive-in theater, a format that had actually been patented in the early 1930s, but that achieved its greatest popularity and widest proliferation across the American landscape during the years immediately following the Second World War. Closely paralleling the broader post-war suburban expansion and the increasing centrality of automobile ownership to American daily life during these years. Drive-in theaters, requiring considerably more land area than a conventional indoor theater, but correspondingly lower construction costs, and offering the particular appeal of allowing entire families, including young children who might otherwise have proven difficult to manage in a conventional indoor theatrical setting, to enjoy an evening's entertainment from the comfort and privacy of their own automobile, proliferated rapidly across suburban and rural America throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, representing one of the more distinctive and, to later generations, nostalgically remembered innovations in how American audiences actually experienced the era's film output, even as the format's particular commercial logic, situated as it was on the outer edges of expanding metropolitan areas rather than within traditional downtown commercial districts, reflected the same broader suburban demographic transformation that was simultaneously reshaping so many other dimensions of post-war American life, and as already discussed, contributing directly to the classic studio system's gradual structural decline. The relationship between Hollywood and American fashion throughout this era represented one of the industry's most far-reaching cultural influences, extending well beyond the theater walls into the daily clothing and grooming choices of ordinary Americans across the country. Costume designers working within the studio system, some of whom achieved genuine celebrity status in their own right and considerable influence over broader American fashion trends, created not merely period-accurate historical costuming for the era's numerous costume dramas, but also for the many contemporary set productions the studios produced each year. A vision of stylish modern dress that department stores and clothing manufacturers across the country moved quickly to translate into commercially available garments for ordinary consumers. A particular gown worn by a popular star in a widely seen picture could, within weeks of that film's release, generate substantial demand for similar styles in department stores nationwide, and the studios themselves, recognizing the promotional and licensing value this influence represented, frequently coordinated directly with clothing manufacturers to produce affordable commercial versions of costumes featured in major releases, timed to reach stores concurrent with a film's theatrical release. This fashion influence extended into broader realms of personal grooming and beauty culture as well, with hairstyles, makeup techniques, and general standards of feminine and masculine appearance popularized through the era's films exercising substantial influence over how ordinary Americans, particularly younger Americans attentive to current style trends, chose to present themselves. Beauty product manufacturers frequently negotiated promotional arrangements with studios and individual performers, producing advertising campaigns that traded on a popular star's endorsement or association with a particular cosmetic or grooming product. An early, and by later standards, relatively unsophisticated version of the celebrity endorsement marketing that would become an increasingly central feature of American consumer advertising throughout the following decades. The cumulative effect of this pervasive fashion and beauty influence meant that the studio system's reach into ordinary American daily life extended considerably beyond the roughly 2 or 3 hours a typical moviegoer might spend in a theater each week, shaping instead a broader visual and aesthetic culture that touched nearly every dimension of how many Americans, and particularly American women, thought about personal style, beauty, and self-presentation throughout these decades. The animation industry, mentioned briefly in an earlier portion of this account, merits considerably more detailed examination given both its substantial commercial success throughout this period and its lasting cultural influence extending well beyond the classic studio era itself. Animated short films had existed as a popular theatrical staple since the silent era, but the medium underwent substantial technical and artistic development throughout the 1930s, driven significantly by innovations in character animation technique, in the synchronization of sound and music with animated action, and eventually, by the middle of the decade, by the introduction of practical color animation processes that transformed the visual possibilities available to animation studios. The release, in the latter half of the 1930s, of the first commercially successful feature-length animated film, representing an enormous financial and creative gamble at the time given the unprecedented scale of hand-drawn animation the project required, established definitively that audiences would embrace animated storytelling at feature length, and this commercial validation opened the door to a sustained period of feature animation production that would continue. With certain interruptions during the more materially constrained wartime years, throughout the following decades, the working conditions within animation studios during this period differed considerably from the live-action production environment already described in detail, reflecting the fundamentally different technical and creative demands of hand-drawn animation as a medium. Animation production required enormous numbers of individual hand-drawn frames, with a single minute of finished animated footage typically requiring somewhere in the range of 700 to 1,400 individual drawings, depending on the frame rate and animation technique employed. And this technical reality required animation studios to employ substantial numbers of specialized artists organized into a detailed production hierarchy, including animators responsible for key poses and movement, in-betweeners responsible for the intermediate frames connecting an animator's key drawings into smooth motion, ink and paint department workers responsible for transferring pencil animation onto the celluloid sheets used for final photography, and applying the actual paint colors specified by a production's color design, and background artists responsible for the painted environments against which the animated characters would ultimately be photographed. This specialized, highly subdivided labor process, while organizationally distinct from live-action film production, reflected a broadly similar industrial logic to the factory-style production model already discussed in connection with live-action studio filmmaking, adapted to the particular technical demands of the animation medium. The commercial success of feature animation throughout this period, and the substantial audience appetite it revealed for this particular form of family-oriented entertainment, encouraged continued investment in the medium, despite its considerable production costs and lengthy production schedules, often requiring several years from initial story development through to a finished feature, a production timeline considerably longer than the typical schedule for even an elaborately produced live-action feature. This extended production timeline required animation studios to maintain a more stable, continuously employed creative workforce than the live-action studio's contract system for performers typically demanded, since the specialized skills required for quality character animation took years to develop and could not easily be replaced through the kind of open casting process that governed live-action performer recruitment. A structural difference that shaped animation studio labor relations and internal culture in ways somewhat distinct from the broader patterns already described for live-action studio production. Turning to a related but distinct dimension of the era's entertainment culture, the particular genre of the movie musical deserves additional attention beyond what has already been discussed. Given both its enormous commercial and cultural significance throughout this period, and the distinctive production demands and specialized talent the genre required. The technical challenges of combining synchronized sound recording with elaborate choreographed dance sequences, particularly demanding during the earliest years of the sound era, when recording technology remained considerably more primitive and less flexible than it would become by later decades, required the development of specialized production techniques, including the use of pre-recorded musical tracks to which performers would lip-sync and dance during actual filming, allowing for camera movement and elaborate staging that would have proven impossible had a production attempted to record usable sound simultaneously with the visual filming of an elaborate dance number. The choreographers responsible for designing these elaborate musical sequences occupied a specialized, and for the era's most accomplished practitioners, genuinely prestigious position within the studio hierarchy, developing over the course of the 1930s and into subsequent decades an increasingly sophisticated visual and technical vocabulary for how the camera itself might participate in and enhance the visual impact of a dance sequence, moving well beyond the simpler, more theatrically static approach to filming dance that had characterized the earliest years of the sound musical. This technical and artistic development produced, across the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s, some of the era's most enduringly celebrated and technically accomplished filmmaking, and the movie musical's particular blend of narrative storytelling, popular song, and elaborate visual spectacle proved consistently reliable at the box office throughout most of this period. Sustaining dedicated musical production units at several major studios that developed particular institutional expertise and a stable of specialized contracted talent, composers, choreographers, and performers with particular musical and dance training, organized specifically around the genre's demanding production requirements. The international dimension of the American film industry's commercial operation throughout this period also deserves attention, since American films found substantial, and, for the industry's overall commercial success, genuinely significant audiences well beyond the domestic American market throughout the studio era. Major studios maintained dedicated international distribution divisions responsible for managing the considerable logistical and, in some markets, political complexity of bringing American films to foreign theatrical markets, work that involved not merely the practical logistics of shipping film prints and negotiating with foreign theater chains and distributors, but also, in many markets, producing dubbed or subtitled versions of American productions adapted for audiences who did not speak English, and in some cases, adjusting content to comply with the differing censorship standards and cultural sensitivities of particular foreign markets. This international market proved substantially more difficult to access during the years of the Second World War, as the conflict disrupted normal commercial relationships across much of Europe and Asia, and as several formerly significant foreign markets became entirely inaccessible to American film distribution for the duration of hostilities. A commercial disruption that added to the broader wartime operational challenges the industry navigated during these years. Following the war's conclusion, American films found renewed, and in a number of markets, even expanded international commercial success, as American popular culture more broadly enjoyed considerable international prestige and appeal during the early post-war decades. And this international revenue stream became an increasingly important component of the industry's overall commercial calculation, as domestic theatrical attendance began its sustained decline through the 1950s, already discussed at length earlier in this account, with international box office revenue helping to offset, at least partially, the declining fortunes of the industry's traditional domestic theatrical business during these transitional years. By the early 1960s, the studio system as it had operated across the preceding 3.5 decades existed, in most meaningful respects, only in a considerably diminished and transformed form. The great contract rosters that had once bound hundreds of performers to a single studio for years at a time had largely dissolved, replaced by the project-by-project negotiations and independent production arrangements already described. The elaborate internal infrastructure of training departments, publicity staffs, and standing technical crews that had once made each major studio a nearly self-sufficient production city had been substantially scaled back, as the economics of an industry now competing directly with television and no longer protected by guaranteed access to studio-owned theater chains simply could not sustain the earlier model's considerable overhead. Several of the founding generation of studio executives, the immigrant entrepreneurs who had built their companies from Nickelodeons and first shops into international entertainment enterprises, retired, sold their controlling interests, or in some cases lived to see their companies absorbed into larger corporate conglomerates with interests extending well beyond the entertainment business. A pattern of corporate consolidation that would continue and accelerate through the following decades in ways that lie beyond the scope of this particular account. What remained, and what continues to shape both the physical landscape of the American film industry and the broader cultural memory of this era, is a substantial body of surviving films, a considerable archive of surviving documentation, contracts, correspondence, publicity material, and personal memoirs, and the accumulated testimony of the performers, writers, directors, and countless technical and craft workers who lived and worked through these decades and who left behind. In interviews, autobiographies, and oral histories conducted by film historians in subsequent years, a far more complete and considerably more complicated picture of the era than the polished publicity, narratives the studios themselves had once so carefully constructed and maintained. It is from this accumulated later testimony, considerably more than from the fan magazines and studio press releases of the era itself, that the fuller picture assembled across this account has been drawn, a picture that holds in balance the genuine creative achievement of the films this system produced alongside the very real human costs that achievement frequently exacted from the people who made it possible. The preservation of this era's physical film legacy has itself become a significant undertaking in the decades since the nitrate film stock in common use throughout much of the classic studio era proved chemically unstable, and, in a considerable number of documented cases, was lost entirely to decomposition, or, in a smaller number of cases, to fire. Before later archival efforts and the industry's own eventual recognition of its historical and commercial value in the television and home video era, prompted more systematic preservation initiatives. A meaningful proportion of the total feature film output of the silent and early sound era has been permanently lost as a result, a sobering reminder that even an industry organized around the mass production and wide distribution of its central product could not guarantee the survival of that product across the passage of time, and that much of what we know and can still watch from this era represents only a portion, however substantial, of everything the system actually produced across its several decades of operation. Considered as a whole, the studio system of Hollywood's golden age presents a genuinely complicated historical picture, one that resists easy reduction to either uncomplicated nostalgic celebration or uncomplicated condemnation. It was a system that produced, across its several decades of dominant operation, an extraordinary body of enduring creative work, films that continue to be watched, studied, and admired by audiences and critics many decades after their original release, work made possible by the genuine talent, skill, and dedication of tens of thousands of performers, writers, directors, and craftspeople who brought their considerable abilities to the demanding, often exhausting work the system required of them. It was, at the very same time, a system built on a profound and often explicitly acknowledged imbalance of power between the small number of executives who controlled access to employment, opportunity, and public visibility, and the far larger population of performers and workers whose livelihoods, and in a great many documented cases, whose health and personal autonomy depended on the goodwill and commercial judgment of those executives. It manufactured glamour, romance, and escapist fantasy for a national and eventually international audience that genuinely needed and valued what it offered, particularly through the hardships of economic depression and world war, even as that same manufacturing process frequently obscured, and in some serious and well-documented cases, actively concealed considerable suffering among the very people responsible for creating it. The bus still arrives, in a sense, though the industry it once carried hopeful young people toward has changed almost beyond recognition since the decades this account has described. The particular studio system, with its long-term contracts, its option renewals, its morality clauses, and its elaborate publicity apparatus, belongs now entirely to history, studied by film scholars and remembered by an ever-shrinking number of people who actually lived and worked within it. What remains, flickering across screens considerably different from the ones this era's audiences once gathered before, are the films themselves, the faces, the voices, the carefully constructed and in their own way genuinely remarkable illusions that this vast, imperfect, and often unforgiving machine somehow managed to produce. They still catch the light. They still hold, for anyone willing to watch closely and to look past the glamour toward the considerable human effort and human cost that glamour required, a great deal worth remembering, and a great deal worth understanding honestly, for exactly what it was. Good night.